What if the most dangerous thing you ever said was something you didn't even notice? Not an insult, not a lie, but a quiet, casual sentence that slipped from your mouth and silently sabotaged your growth, your relationships, and the respect you once held. I didn't realize it either. Years ago, I was sitting in a small office, coffee in hand, reviewing a routine task with a mentor I deeply admired, a man known more for his silence than his speeches. He began offering me advice, and without thinking, I cut him off with a smile and said, "Yeah, I know that already." He paused, no judgment. Just a long look, and then he moved on. It wasn't until hours later, alone in my apartment, that it hit me I hadn't just dismissed his words. I had dismissed the opportunity to see something through his eyes, to learn what decades of hard-earned experience might have revealed, and for what ego, the illusion of competence. That day marked a turning point. It taught me this truth: intelligent men aren't the ones who know the most, they're the ones who never stop learning. And that's where we begin. Today we're exploring 7 quiet phrases that smart men never say, and why avoiding them might just change your life. Have you ever caught yourself saying, "Yeah, I already know that"? Not out loud necessarily, maybe just in your mind, in a meeting, in a conversation, listening to someone speak. That quiet, automatic phrase, "I already know this." It seems harmless, almost confident, but beneath the surface, it reveals something much more dangerous: a closed door, a mind that has stopped reaching. Years ago, I sat across from a mentor, a man who had walked through more storms than I could name. He had this presence about him, calm, measured, like he'd seen the world lose its mind and still chose patience. We were reviewing a task I had done many times before. I thought I was being efficient, so when he began to explain it again, I waved it off with a casual, "Yeah, I already know that." He didn't argue. He didn't correct me. He just paused, looked at me with this heavy silence, and continued. But that look stayed with me, and hours later I realized what had really happened. I hadn't just interrupted him. I had robbed myself of the one thing that makes great men different from average ones: the ability to learn what they do not yet see. You see, when you say, "I already know," that what you're really saying is, "I have nothing left to learn here." And that is never true. Not if you want to grow, not if you want to evolve into something deeper, stronger, wiser. The Stoics knew this. Marcus Aurelius, one of the most powerful men in history, warned us plainly. You cannot learn anything when you think you already know everything. That one sentence carries centuries of wisdom, because the moment your ego convinces you that you've arrived, that you've mastered this, seen it all, heard it all, that is the precise moment your growth dies. The ancient Stoics weren't interested in the appearance of knowledge. They sought truth, clarity, humility, and nothing kills those faster than a man who refuses to listen. What I've learned painfully over time is that true intelligence is not about being right. It's about being open. The world doesn't stand still. The river never flows the same way twice. You may walk into a conversation thinking it's old ground, but the perspective, you hear the emotion, the timing, the subtle nuance, it might just carry the one insight that unlocks everything for you. I once watched a master carpenter, easily in his 60s, listening to a 19-year-old apprentice explain a new joining technique. The kid was eager, maybe a little clumsy, but passionate. The old man didn't interrupt. He didn't roll his eyes. He nodded, asked questions, thanked him for the input. Later, I asked him why. Why not just tell the kid he'd known that method for 30 years? He smiled and said, "Sometimes you don't learn from the idea itself. You learn from how someone else sees it." That stayed with me, because that's wisdom. The kind that doesn't need to announce itself. The kind that doesn't care about looking smart. The kind that is smart because it's rooted in humility. But in our world today, where everyone's rushing to prove themselves to be the loudest voice in the room to correct others mid-sentence, we've mistaken quickness for sharpness. We think interrupting someone with "I already know" that earns respect. It doesn't. It shows you're more interested in appearing competent than actually being wise. And if we're honest, it's often fear that drives that reaction. Fear of looking ignorant. Fear of being seen as less capable. So we put on this armor of knowledge even when we're still learning, still unsure, and we cut off the very thing that could help us grow. But intelligent men, real intelligent men, understand this paradox. You become wise by admitting you are still learning. You become strong by acknowledging that you don't see everything yet. And you earn respect not by knowing it all, but by having the courage to listen. There's a quiet power in listening, in letting someone finish, in staying open, in asking, is there something here I haven't thought about yet? The Stoics called that mastery of the self the ability to override the ego, to set aside pride in favor of clarity. Because pride wants to win the moment, but wisdom wants to win the life. So the next time you catch yourself drifting, tuning out, getting ready to dismiss someone with, yeah, I already know that, pause, breathe, and remember, you're not there to defend your intelligence. You're there to expand it. Even if the lesson feels familiar, ask yourself, what am I missing? What's new here that I couldn't have seen 5 years ago? What might this person's experience offer me that I haven't lived yet? Because the man who listens, even when he thinks he's heard it all before, is the man who will grow deeper, stronger, and clearer, while others stay stuck thinking they already know. Don't let your pride close the door on your evolution. Leave it open. Stay curious. And become the kind of man whose intelligence needs no announcement, because it shows up in the way you listen, in the questions you ask, and in the growth you never stop pursuing. There's a phrase that intelligent men have learned to eliminate from their vocabulary, not because it sounds wrong, but because it quietly surrenders to fear before the battle even begins. That phrase is, that's impossible. On the surface, it seems like a practical response, even responsible. It suggests a man who knows his limits, who isn't willing to chase after fantasies. But underneath it reveals something far more dangerous, a man who has already stopped believing in change, in effort and growth. I remember working years ago with a man named Robert. He was respected, accomplished, the kind of leader who seemed to hold the entire company together by sheer force of reliability. He always had the right numbers, the risk assessments, the solid projections. And yet, every time a new idea was introduced, whether it was entering a new market, pivoting a stale system, or simply doing something that hadn't been done before, he'd shut it down with those two small words. That's impossible. Not with anger, not with hostility. Just calm, confident, definitive. And at first we all mistook it for wisdom, but over time something became painfully clear. Robert wasn't describing the limits of reality. He was describing the limits of his imagination, of his courage. What he was really saying again and again was, I can't see how, so it must not be. And that's where intelligent men take a different path. They know that just because you can't see the whole staircase doesn't mean the first step isn't right in front of you. The Stoics understood this kind of resignation. Seneca wrote, we suffer more in imagination than in reality. And isn't that exactly what happens when we call something impossible? We project our fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of uncertainty onto the world, and then treat that projection as truth. But fear disguised as logic is still fear. It just wears a better suit. When you say that's impossible, you're not describing the world, you're describing yourself. And that's what I began to realize after Robert left the company, and I was put on a project that frankly looked doomed. The budget was tight, the deadline was unrealistic, the team was young and under pressure. Every bone in my body wanted to echo his words and say, this can't be done. But something held me back. Instead of asking, can we finish this on time? I asked a smaller, sharper question. What can I do today that moves us 1 inch forward? That question changed everything. We didn't pull off miracles. We made small, relentless progress. And the impossible slowly became inevitable. That project went on to become one of the most successful of my career, not because it was easy, but because we refused to let fear write our narrative. Marcus Aurelius said, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. And that's the core of it. Intelligent men don't measure possibility by comfort. They measure it by clarity, by what is within their control. They don't need guarantees. They need direction. They've learned that the obstacle is never the final answer. It's the invitation, the challenge, the hidden door disguised as a wall. And they don't waste time asking if it can be done. They ask how they must change to make it possible. And that's a shift most men never make. Because it's easier to label something impossible than to admit that it terrifies you, that you might try and fail, that you might succeed and have to grow into a new version of yourself. But if you want to lead, to evolve, to become the man you're capable of becoming, You must kill that phrase at the root. Burn it out of your mind. Because once you call something impossible, you stop looking for the angle, the crack, the unconventional route. You stop adjusting, you stop adapting, and eventually you stop moving altogether. Intelligent men understand that most of what feels impossible is simply unfamiliar. That fear is often the first sign that something meaningful is about to happen. So they don't retreat. They lean in. And no, this doesn't mean reckless optimism. It means strategic persistence, quiet discipline. It means acknowledging the fear but not obeying it. It means waking up every day and asking, what's the next step I can take, even if it's small? And over time, those steps build something unshakable. The man who refuses to declare defeat before the fight begins is already halfway to winning. He might not know the outcome, but he knows the direction, and that's all he needs. Because strength is not born from certainty, it's built in the process of continuing anyway. That's stoic courage, not loud, not flashy, but steady, grounded, focused on what can be done now. And I'll tell you this, some of the most powerful men I've known have had the quietest belief systems. They never said that's impossible. They said, let me think about it, or let's try one piece of it, or even what are we missing? Because questions open doors, but declarations like, that's impossible, slam them shut. And if there's one truth that has shaped my life more than most, it's this: every breakthrough I've ever had was preceded by a moment where part of me thought it couldn't be done. But I did it anyway. And so can you. You don't need to believe in magic. You don't need perfect conditions. You need resolve and a willingness to ask a better question, because that's impossible is a dead end. But what can I do right now? That's a map. And maps, even if they're rough and incomplete, still lead somewhere. Intelligent men follow those, not because they know what's ahead, but because they know who they are. There's a quiet poison in the phrase, that's not my fault. It sounds innocent, rational, even justified. But in truth, it's one of the most self-limiting beliefs a man can cling to. Because every time you say it, you're not just avoiding blame, you're giving away your power. Intelligent men, men who lead with clarity and strength, understand this distinction deeply. They've learned often the hard way that responsibility isn't about guilt, it's about growth. It's not about absorbing every failure, but about reclaiming the one thing that truly belongs to you, your ability to respond to, act to shape the future. I remember watching this play out with a friend of mine named Michael. He had just lost a major client, one he'd worked with for years, and the blow was devastating. His first reaction, total deflection. He said the client was unreasonable, that the market had shifted, that his team missed deadlines. And to be fair, he wasn't wrong. Those things were true. But as I listened to him explain it all, I realized he was so busy proving it wasn't his fault that he had completely missed the opportunity to learn anything from it. He wasn't asking what he could have done differently. He wasn't owning even a fraction of the outcome. And because of that, he stayed stuck. Weeks passed, then months. And I watched as the same problems repeated in different forms, like a pattern he couldn't see, because he had chosen not to. And that's the real tragedy of, that's not my fault. It freezes you in place. It locks you into a posture of defense, where your energy is spent protecting your ego instead of improving your effectiveness. The Stoics warned us about this. Epictetus said, it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. And that's not just philosophy, it's psychological truth. The moment you decide to own your part in a problem, no matter how small, you shift from being powerless to powerful. You stop waiting for the world to change and start becoming the man who adapts, who evolves, who leads. It's not always comfortable. In fact, sometimes it feels like swallowing broken glass. Because taking responsibility often means admitting that you missed something, that you could have prepared better, communicated more clearly, shown up differently. But every time you make that admission, you gain something infinitely more valuable than a clean record. You gain self-mastery. And that's the difference between a man who blames and a man who builds. One looks backward and points, the other looks inward and levels up. I've been on both sides of this equation. There was a time in my life when I defaulted to blame, like it was my birthright. If a project fell apart, I'd find the nearest excuse. If a relationship went cold, I'd focus on what she did wrong. And for a while it worked, at least on the surface. I got to feel right. I got to keep my pride intact. But underneath, I felt stagnant. I wasn't growing. I wasn't becoming better. I was just building a case for why I didn't need to. And that's a slow death for any man who actually wants to lead himself. The turning point came during a tough conversation with someone I respected, a mentor who didn't pull punches. I had just finished explaining why a situation wasn't my fault, and he looked at me and said, "You're not wrong, but you're not helping yourself either." That hit me like a brick. Because it was true. I had spent years being technically correct, but emotionally stuck. And from that moment on, I began to ask a new question. Not whose fault is this, but what part of this can I own, even if it's just 10%. And that changed everything. I started communicating with more clarity, leading with more intention, and viewing failure not as humiliation, but as information, as feedback. And as I did, something surprising happened. People trusted me more. Not because I was perfect, but because I didn't run from accountability. And when you become that kind of man, the one who doesn't flinch from owning his mistakes, you become someone others can depend on. Because if you're willing to face your own role in a breakdown, you're the kind of person who can be trusted to create a breakthrough. The truth is, blame is easy. It's passive. It requires nothing but a finger pointed outward. Responsibility is hard. It's uncomfortable. But it builds the kind of resilience and clarity that no one can take from you. In a world that constantly offers you a way to escape ownership through excuses, deflections, and convenient half-truths, the intelligent man stands out by choosing the opposite. He says, maybe this isn't all my fault, but what can I learn from it anyway? That mindset separates those who merely survive from those who rise. The Stoics didn't teach us to avoid difficulty. They taught us to face it head-on, to see every challenge as a forge where character is made. And nothing forges character faster than taking responsibility for your own path. Not in a way that burdens you with shame, but in a way that liberates you with truth. Because once you own your choices, you can change them. Once you claim your role in a failure, you can reshape the story that follows. And that's what real leadership looks like. It's not about being flawless, it's about being accountable. So the next time you feel the urge to say, "That's not my fault," pause. Ask yourself, even if I'm not to blame, is there something here I can own? Something I can do differently next time? Because that's where strength lives, not in avoiding mistakes, but in transforming them into lessons. Intelligent men know this, and that's why they never surrender to the illusion of innocence when growth is on the line. One of the most dangerous lies a man can tell himself doesn't come wrapped in arrogance or spoken in anger. It comes in silence and solitude, and in the quiet, determined voice that whispers, "I don't need any help." It sounds noble, self-reliant, even heroic. After all, isn't that what strength is supposed to look like? A man standing tall, carrying everything on his shoulders, never flinching, never asking, never needing. That's the myth, the lone wolf, the silent warrior, the man who handles his pain behind closed doors and wears composure like armor. But here's the truth that every intelligent man eventually comes to understand. The refusal to ask for help is not a reflection of strength. It's a symptom of pride, of isolation, and sometimes of fear. Because deep down, we don't avoid help because we're strong, we avoid it because we're afraid of what it means to be seen as weak. We avoid it because we've been conditioned to equate vulnerability with failure. But nothing could be further from the truth. I remember the first time I realized this. It was during one of the heaviest seasons of my life. Work was overwhelming, my relationships were cracking under pressure, and my body was giving me signals I had ignored for far too long. And yet when someone close to me asked, "Are you okay? Do you need anything?" I smiled and said, "I've got it." And I believed it. I believed that keeping it all together meant keeping it to myself. That admitting I couldn't do it alone would make me less of a man. But what it really did was make me brittle. Quietly, invisibly, I was burning out from the inside. That's what happens when you try to carry everything alone. The weight doesn't make you stronger, it crushes you. And the longer you pretend, the heavier it gets. The Stoics never taught that we must go it alone. Marcus Aurelius, emperor of Rome, arguably one of the most powerful men to walk the earth, wrote extensively in his journals meditations about the debts he owed to others, to his mentors, his teachers, his friends. He didn't hide his dependence, he honored it. He understood that strength isn't found in isolation, but in wisdom. And wisdom often speaks in the voice of another person if you're willing to hear it. We've created a culture that glorifies the man who stands apart, but the men who truly endure are those who know when to reach out. Take Abraham Lincoln, for example. History often paints him as a solitary figure, burdened by the weight of a nation, but what's overlooked is how deeply he leaned on others. He filled his cabinet with rivals men who challenged his thinking, disagreed with him, pushed him to refine his vision. He didn't surround himself with silence, he surrounded himself with strength. And it wasn't because he lacked confidence, it was because he had enough of it to know he couldn't lead alone. And neither can we. Yet so many men drift into quiet corners of their lives, convinced that if they just try harder, push more, swallow the pain deeper, they'll be fine. But they're not fine. They're breaking in slow motion. And what's worse, their silence robs the people around them of the chance to show up, to carry some of the burden. When you say, "I don't need any help," you're not just isolating yourself. You're denying others the chance to connect, to care, to be needed. And that disconnect creates a ripple effect. It makes you harder to reach, harder to understand. Eventually, it makes you invisible even to the people who love you most. I've seen men crumble beneath the image of invulnerability they spent years building. I've seen them hold it together in public while unraveling in private. And the tragic part is they didn't have to. All they needed to do was speak, just once, just enough to let someone in. And when they finally did, when they dropped the armor for even a moment, they discovered what real strength feels like, not the strength of control, but the strength of connection, the strength of being seen, understood, and supported. Intelligent men know this. They know that asking for help doesn't mean you're failing, it means you're wise enough to recognize the limits of one life, one body, one mind. It means you value your mission enough to protect your capacity to carry it out. And it means you trust that strength isn't something you have to prove by enduring more than anyone else. It's something you build with others through honesty, humility, and courage. I'll never forget the moment I finally opened up to someone I trusted. I didn't have a speech prepared. I didn't even have the right words. I just said, "I can't do this by myself anymore." And instead of judgment, I was met with relief, understanding, support. That simple confession gave me something I hadn't felt in years: oxygen. Not because the problems vanished, but because I wasn't carrying them alone anymore. From that moment on, I understood that real masculinity isn't silent suffering. It's intentional strength. It's knowing when to reach out a hand and when to take one. The Stoics taught that we are made for cooperation, that no man is an island. And the longer we pretend otherwise, the more we betray the very nature of being alive. So the next time you feel that instinct rise up, the one that tells you to tighten your jaw, to say, "I've got this," to carry it all in silence, pause. Ask yourself, is this strength speaking or pride in disguise? Because the man who never asks for help may look strong for a while, but the man who knows when to reach out will endure. And that's what this is all about. Not surviving, enduring, not isolating, integrating, not proving something, but building something. And no man builds anything great alone. There's a particular phrase that carries more weight than we often realize, not because of how loud it is, but because of how quietly it kills ambition. I'm too old for that. It rarely arrives in a dramatic outburst. Instead, it slips in through casual conversation, tucked inside a joke, or a sigh dressed up as wisdom or practicality. But underneath the surface, it's rarely about age. It's about resignation. It's about a man slowly convincing himself that the best parts of his story have already been written, that there's nothing left worth risking for dreaming about or building from scratch. And that's a lie. A dangerous, slow-acting lie that chips away at a man's soul, one dismissed opportunity at a time. I've heard it come from men in their 50s, 60s, even 40s men who still have decades of life ahead of them, but who've started to believe that possibility belongs to the younger crowd. That creativity has an expiration date. That adventure, reinvention, or new beginnings are luxuries they've aged out of. But here's the truth: intelligent men know that age isn't the enemy of purpose. It's often the beginning of it, because purpose doesn't come from youth, it comes from clarity. And clarity, more often than not, comes from time scars and the accumulated weight of a life that's been lived deeply. I once read about a man named Harry Bernstein, a name you might not know unless you've looked for stories like his. Harry was 93 years old when he decided to write his first book. 93. After a lifetime spent raising a family, working in publishing, and living through a world war. He sat down and began to write. The book was called The Invisible Wall, a memoir about growing up in a poor English town divided by religion and prejudice. It was rejected by publishers several times. But Harry didn't stop. He kept writing, kept revising, kept submitting. And finally, at age 96, his book was published. It became an international success, translated into multiple languages, and touched readers around the world. He went on to write 3 more books before passing away at 101. Now pause for a second and let that settle in. The man's literary legacy didn't begin until he was nearly a century old. Why? Because he didn't believe the lie that it was too late. He didn't let the mirror or the calendar dictate his creative worth. He didn't let other people's assumptions about age become his limitations. And that's a lesson every man needs to hear. Because there comes a point, whether you're 38 or 68, when the temptation to retreat from life becomes very real. You start to tell yourself that the big moves are for the younger guys, that you've missed your moment, that your contribution has already peaked. But that's just the voice of fear dressed up in realism. And intelligent men know how to recognize that voice for what it is. The Stoics taught that we should live fully and virtuously until our very last breath. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily that death could come at any moment, not to be morbid, but to sharpen his sense of urgency. He understood that meaning doesn't fade with age, it ripens. If you're still here, you're not done. If you can think, reflect, build, or teach, you still have work to do. The question isn't whether you're too old. The question is whether you've allowed your fire to go out. Because age doesn't extinguish fire, resignation does. And once that resignation sets in, it's not just your dreams that fade. Your sense of identity, vitality, and emotional connection to the world starts to dim. You become a ghost in your own life, moving through routines instead of rising to purpose. But that doesn't have to be your story. I've known men who learned new trades in their 60s, launched businesses in their 70s, mentored others well into their 80s. These weren't extraordinary men. They were simply men who refused to shut the door on their potential. They asked different questions. Instead of, "Am I too old for this?" they asked, "What can I begin now that matters deeply to me?" And that one shift changed the entire trajectory of their lives. They didn't chase youth, they chased meaning. And in doing so, they created something better than nostalgia. They created legacy. And that's where this idea becomes truly powerful, because when you reject the notion that you're too old, you don't just reclaim your sense of self, you become a beacon for others. You show your sons, your peers, your community that age is not a sentence. It's a season. And like every season, it has its own kind of power, its own kind of harvest. When younger men see an older man still building, still striving, still learning, they see a map, a model. Proof that their lives don't end when their hair turns gray or their knees start to ache, and that impact, that ripple effect. It's immeasurable. So if you've ever caught yourself saying, "I'm too old for that," I want to challenge you to look deeper. Ask yourself where that voice is coming from. Is it truth or is it tiredness? Is it wisdom or is it fear of beginning again? Because beginnings don't belong to the young, they belong to the brave. And as long as you are still breathing, you have the right to begin again. Intelligent men know that age doesn't disqualify them from living boldly. It gives them more to offer: experience, perspective, resilience. These aren't signs that you're finished, they're tools that you've earned. And the world needs what you've gathered, what you've survived, what you've learned along the way. Don't withhold that just because of a number. Don't let regret do the talking. And don't assume the final chapter has been written without your permission. You are not too old, you are not too late. You are right on time if you're willing to begin. There are few phrases as deceptively dangerous as "I'll do it later." It's not loud. It doesn't scream for attention. It doesn't carry the obvious destructiveness of anger or the finality of words like never or impossible. Instead, it disguises itself as harmless logic, a quiet whisper of reason, a mental note penciled into the future that we secretly hope we'll have time to rewrite. But make no mistake, "I'll do it later" is where dreams go to die. It's the graveyard of our most sincere intentions, the silent assassin of our deepest goals, and the thief of every heartfelt conversation we were just too busy to have. Intelligent men have learned often through the bitter sting of loss that later is not a promise, it's a gamble. A fragile, unguaranteed maybe. And depending on it is like building a foundation on fog. I once knew a man named Thomas, successful, respected, the kind of guy people went to when they needed solutions. His business was booming, his calendar always full, And yet one thing kept getting pushed further down his list, calling his father. Just a call. Nothing dramatic. Just a voice across the line saying, "How are you? I've been thinking about you." He told himself he'd do it when things at the office calmed down, when the quarter ended, when the pressure lifted. But the quarter ended and the pressure didn't. And then suddenly there was no father left to call. A heart attack came quietly in the middle of the night, and with it the last chance to say the things that now burned in his chest. I remember sitting with him weeks later. He didn't cry, not in front of me, but he looked at his phone like it had betrayed him, like it owed him something. It was filled with unsent messages, drafts of words he never spoke, things he meant to say, love he meant to express, and now all of it sat there useless, silent. That's what later does. It numbs us into believing that time is on our side, that the people we love will always be there, that our energy will last, that the perfect moment will come. But the Stoics, as always, saw through the illusion. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily, "You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think. Not to breed fear, but to awaken presence. Because life is not lived in the future, it is only ever lived now." And intelligent men understand that waiting isn't neutral. It is in fact a decision. A decision to delay what matters, a decision to defer clarity, a decision to place our peace, our purpose, and our growth into a tomorrow that may never arrive. Think about how often we use later as a shield from discomfort. We tell ourselves we'll apologize next week once the anger fades. We'll start the difficult project when we feel more inspired. We'll tell our wife what we really feel when the timing's better. But the perfect moment doesn't come, it has to be created. It has to be seized, wrestled out of the noise of life. And that requires courage. Not the kind of courage that moves mountains, but the kind that picks up the phone. That starts the sentence. That takes the first trembling step. In my own life, I've buried more things in later than I care to admit. Letters I meant to write, reunions I postponed. Forgiveness I withheld, waiting for the right time to be less bitter. But time doesn't make bitterness fade, it makes it root deeper. And when I finally acted, when I stopped waiting and leaned into the discomfort, something shifted. The anxiety that had built up around the action dissolved. The burden lifted. And I realized something I should have known all along: action is the medicine. Intention is not enough. Planning is not enough. Wisdom without execution is still regret in disguise. That's the paradox. Doing the thing is rarely as painful as imagining it over and over without moving. Intelligent men don't let themselves become prisoners of procrastination. They understand that later is the luxury of a man who believes he controls time, and they know he doesn't. So they act. They start small. They call now. They say thank you now. They forgive now. Not because it's easy, but because it's real. Because there's no guarantee the door will still be open next week. Because people leave. Circumstances change. And time, that quiet river we think we're floating down gently, has a current stronger than we know. If you've ever told yourself, "I'll do it later," I invite you to look at what you're postponing. Is it a conversation, a creative pursuit, a habit you know you need to build? Ask yourself why it hasn't happened yet. Ask yourself what fear lives beneath the delay. And then ask this: what would happen if I just began today, badly, imperfectly, awkwardly, but honestly? Because beginning is the only cure for waiting. And every man who builds something meaningful eventually realizes this: the world doesn't wait for us to be ready, it moves, with or without us. The question is, will you move with it, or will you let later be the quiet ending to a life that could have been lived so much more fully? Intelligent men choose now, not because they're reckless, but because they're awake. Because they understand that time is not a resource, it's a gift. And it runs out whether you're paying attention or not. There are few phrases more quietly destructive than the ones so many men tell themselves without even realizing its cost. That's just how I am. On the surface, it sounds like self-awareness. It sounds like acceptance, even authenticity. But in reality, it's something else entirely. It's surrender. It's a quiet resignation dressed up as identity. When a man says, "That's just how I am," what he's really saying is, "I've stopped trying to change." It's a full stop at the end of a sentence that should still be unfolding. And for intelligent men, men who are committed to self-mastery, to truth, to growth, that phrase becomes a line in the sand. Because the moment you declare yourself fixed, you cut yourself off from transformation. You stop evolving. You choose comfort over courage. And what begins as self-description soon becomes self-imprisonment. I've seen this play out countless times. A man lashes out in anger and justifies it with, "I've always had a temper. It's just how I am." Another avoids intimacy, afraid to be vulnerable, and masks it with, "I've never been good with feelings. I'm just not that guy." These aren't insights, they're excuses. They allow us to stay small to avoid the difficult and often painful process of change. Because real change demands something terrifying. It demands accountability. It demands discomfort. It demands that we look at the parts of ourselves we've kept hidden and ask, is this really who I want to be? The Stoics confronted this directly. Epictetus taught that we are not disturbed by things themselves, but by the judgments we place on them. Likewise, we are not trapped by our nature, but by the story we keep telling ourselves about that nature. In other words, the man who says, "That's just how I am," is not speaking truth. He's defending a version of himself that no longer serves him. And often that defense is rooted in pain, in wounds never addressed, in behaviors that were once survival mechanisms but have long since outlived their usefulness. It takes enormous strength to look at yourself and admit that the way you've always been might not be who you're meant to remain, but intelligent men understand that who you are is not a finished product. It's a process, a practice, a commitment to refinement, and that means questioning the very habits and traits you once assumed were permanent. Maybe you weren't born impatient, you just never learned to breathe through frustration. Maybe you're not bad at relationships, you're just afraid of being truly seen. Maybe you're not wired to fail, you just haven't yet given yourself permission to break the cycle. The truth is, we all carry the weight of old stories about who we are, what we're capable of, what we're allowed to become. But intelligent men refuse to be ruled by those stories. They challenge them. They rewrite them. They ask again and again, is this belief building the man I want to be, or is it holding him back? And if the answer is the latter, they change. Not because change is easy, but because stagnation is worse. In my own life, I've clung to, "That's just how I am," more times than I'd like to admit. There were years I told myself I couldn't lead because I wasn't charismatic enough, that I couldn't heal because I wasn't built for forgiveness, that I couldn't create because I wasn't one of those people born with vision. And yet every time I pushed through one of those narratives, I discovered that my limitations weren't truths, they were habits. And habits can be broken. They can be rewritten. They can be transcended. But only if you're willing to stop defending them. There is a kind of brutal freedom in letting go of the need to explain yourself. In refusing to be boxed in by labels you didn't choose but kept repeating until they became familiar. There is power in saying, maybe I don't know who I could become because I've never given myself the chance to find out. That's the beginning of transformation. And no, it doesn't happen overnight. It happens slowly with effort, with missteps, with doubt. But it happens because you are not your worst trait. You are not your past. You are not the sum of what you've tolerated or normalized. You are what you choose again and again in the face of those old patterns. And if you can choose something better, something truer, then you can become someone better. Not someone perfect, just someone more aligned with who you were always meant to be. The man who clings to, "That's just how I am," builds walls around his potential. But the man who says, "I'm willing to change," opens doors both for himself and for those who walk beside him. So if you've caught yourself uttering those words out loud or in your head, pause, breathe. Ask yourself, who told me that's all I could be? And what might my life look like if I no longer believed it? Because the truth is, life itself is change. To resist change is to resist life. And intelligent men don't resist it. They rise with it. They embrace it. They allow it to shape them into something deeper, wiser, freer. And that more than any fixed trait or inherited tendency is what defines a man of real strength. At some point in every man's life, there comes a quiet reckoning. It doesn't always come with a crisis. Sometimes it arrives in silence, in the hollow feeling, after another missed opportunity, another apology never spoken, another goal put off until later. What the Stoic philosophers and the experiences of wise men throughout history teach us is simple but difficult, that growth begins when excuses end. The phrases we use, "I already know that," "That's not my fault," "I'm too old for that," "I'll do it later," or "That's just how I am," might seem harmless. But they're not. They are subtle self-sabotage wrapped in the comfort of habit. And they all share one thing in common: they shut down the possibility of transformation. The most important lesson is this: you are not finished. Not if you're still breathing. Not if there's still work to do in the world. The intelligent man doesn't pretend to be perfect, he commits to progress. He learns to recognize the moments when pride, fear, or resignation are speaking, and he replaces those voices with better questions. What can I learn right now? How can I take responsibility? What can I begin today? Because the truth is, identity is not a sentence. It's a decision made daily. You are the author of your life. And every time you act from courage instead of comfort, humility instead of ego, honesty instead of habit, you write a better chapter. So stop waiting for the perfect moment. Stop defending the version of you that no longer serves your future. Start where you are. Do the hard thing now. That is how strong men are made quietly, consistently in the moments no one else sees.